Hey everyone, so we got quite a bit of pushback to our last video with Emperor Kalos having so much AI imagery. First and foremost, we want to state right out that Kalos did 100% of the work on the video editing and the like for that collab, and that we literally just helped write and read the script. It is, so far, the only video on our channel with any AI imagery, and unless we happen to do a collaboration with another big channel that uses a lot of AI, it will remain the only one. However, we understand that the internet might not take that as very honest, so we wanted to make sure the first video we did after used art from a small creator from our own little insular digital community who could really use some attention. This vid won't have nearly as many different images, but it does support a small artist. Please support them by finding their links in the description. Behold, the background. Better than any soulless machine could ever give.
The year is 780 Common Era, or 3478 in the Chinese calendar, year of the metal monkey. A typhoon like no other blasts along Southeast Asia and Australasia, scarring the coastlines and throwing ships off course from the Solomon Islands all the way to Taiwan. Bearing north, the great storm drags a simple Polynesian trader from his path and onto the shores of some land to the distant northwest. He is aided by a group of officials that find him and his ship floating off the coast of their lands, waving him in to help him. His trek to what is modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia has gone awry. Now, he is told, he finds himself in the hallowed lands of China. And here, though he does not yet know it, he will change the path of history.
Welcome back, attractive and well-educated watchers, to a brand new alternate history scenario on this channel, a collaboration video we hope will grow into its own series here with a very special friend, Avaline Ryu.
Hello everyone, I'm Avaline Ryu and I'm on Philosophize's channel to present an alternate history setting that we brainstormed together. It's basically what if Tang Chinese mariners went to the New World and developed civilization there.
Now, to get something out of the way before we even get into the appetizers of this particular scenario, we've sort of made a thing on this channel so far that our scenarios are unrealistic but not impossible. The only exception to this has been our collaboration with Emperor Kalos and our recent video of our trip to Trajan's Rome, which both only invoked time travel as the inciting incident and otherwise maintain realism, or rather possibility, whenever possible. There's technically nothing that was stopping Emperor Meiji from trolling his way to an early World War I with the Ottoman Empire. There's technically no reason why Constantine XI couldn't have found a map of Vinland and escaped with his people to the New World. There are many reasons to think MacArthur could have become president of the United States and gone all nuclear obsessive. All of those timelines are highly unlikely for a variety of reasons, but none of them are necessarily impossible. This one is. We're not going to tell you what or where. It will be abundantly apparent exactly when it happens. You'll all know. At some point, this scenario will shift genres from unrealistic, but at least tangentially grounded alternate history, to outright fantasy. Maybe not this video, but it will happen. That being said, until that point, we're going to stick to the age-old formula of unrealistic, but not impossible. Even after that point in time, we will continue to try to be as sensible as we can with it and follow as not impossible a trajectory as we can get after the fact. There's literally one impossible thing in the entire long-term timeline of this scenario, and it, by itself, will make a big change all its own. Otherwise, we're going to follow our standard rules. Now, how could Tang China have gotten to the New World by itself? Well, it couldn't. It wasn't going to happen. While ship hull technology was decent enough and made for Pacific travel, Chinese designs in general were fairly stagnant for many more centuries. Their food preservation and storage technology was some of the best in the world at the time, and so it is no question that the ships could survive the Pacific and the holds contain enough food to make the journey. Furthermore, cartography and astronomy were a major Chinese calling, the best in the world at the time as well. But literally everything else, across all metrics, is insufficient. The Pacific Ocean, you see, is not the Atlantic. Though fairly calm compared to the pond between America and Europe, the Pacific is an entirely different beast in its own right. Just the distance over water from Tokyo to Vancouver Island is over 4,500 miles. The route from New York to Portugal is like 3,500 miles. Even a short hop across the Pacific is over 1,000 miles more. Meanwhile, the distance from Indonesia to Colombia is over 12,000 miles. Hawaii isn't even halfway across the Pacific from America. That's the Midway Islands. And throughout the entirety of the South Pacific, there are tons of hideous little rocks and dead lagoons unable to support a human population that have a history of swallowing up human boats and perhaps at least one airwoman by the name of Amelia Earhart. So it stands to reason that the Chinese are dealing with a harrowing affair in front of them. However, we can absolutely make up for this by presenting them with a few points of divergence that will not only be realistic, but entirely expected. The Pacific is home to giant storms and all manner of people who could have made the trip. So it stands to reason that nature can take care of things for us in this timeline without any need to suspend one's imagination. At least not right away.
Around 780, a crew of traders from Polynesia get blown off course due to a typhoon and end up in China instead of Indonesia. So, after they are conducted to the Imperial Court of China and present their seafaring technology, Emperor Dezong is impressed and grows obsessed with the new idea going to sea. But he still has his own matters to attend to at this time. For the time being, he requests the Polynesian traders to stay in China and has a lake constructed to store the Polynesian ship as a sort of waterborne museum. The Polynesians, for their part, will teach the local Chinese seafarers their navigation methods to better traverse the seas. They are greatly rewarded for their trouble, namely land and titles.
You see, Emperor Dezong was a busy man, so he couldn't just sit around and babysit his new favorite aristocratic family from the distant east. Quite the contrary, the early reign of Emperor Dezong was a difficult one full of rebellions and courtly intrigue that would make the modern Game of Thrones enjoyers' heads spin. It wasn't just the standard stuff, but an entire separate court of eunuchs that directly competed with the aristocracy for imperial favor. In our timeline, Emperor Dezong spent most of his first 10 years of his reign both trying to stamp down rebellions and rival nations at his borders, as well as control the extremely dangerous courtly life of his empire, and having all those generals out of the palace and all the eunuchs in the palace with him made him an exceedingly paranoid man in regards to the aristocracy. In reality, it took 6 years for him to gain control of all of Tang China, and then he still had to fight the Tibetans for nearly half a decade more. By the time he had finally taken care of all of the very real military problems that China faced, his generals had become superstars in their own right, pulling extreme loyalty from their soldiers and detracting from the attention that could be granted to Dezong himself. Behind closed doors, the eunuch court was constantly telling Dezong that they were conspiring against him, that they would overturn him, that they were scheming to kill him. So, following their advice, he had those generals killed. However, in this timeline, a new path has shown itself in the form of his new favorite, the Polynesian family that has spent the last decade teaching Polynesian wayfinding, helping to update star maps, and raising an entirely new generation of sailors to put on these new ships.
The new ships are built according to a combination Polynesian and Chinese shipwrightery, namely the former's double hulls and clamshell sails, along with the Chinese paddle wheels. From the basic idea of the Qian Li Chuan or Thousand Li boat being powered by human paddling alone, the new ships had a backup option of using a similar mechanism to the pottery wheel to move the ship without wind by simply stepping on the mechanism and using the weight of the human body. This mechanism will eventually evolve into a rudimentary flywheel that will lead to further development of engines in the future. In addition, cargo and passenger transport concepts are improved upon for longer voyages. They could hold up to 500 people at a time, along with animals and cargo to supply said passenger. New food preservation technologies developed alongside these ships to accommodate the longer trips. As far as the supposed conspiracy about the generals is concerned, Dezong decides the safest way to deal with them in this alternate timeline is to get them to conquer Japan. He proclaims that their skills as well as the latest cutting edge in naval technology will help them in their mission. The generals, for their part, agree to the new mission, although they are aware that they may not return from the voyage.
This was, for the record, an extremely common tactic among Chinese emperors for as long as Chinese society had persisted. Even way back in the first legendary discovery of Japan, a Chinese emperor sent a general off to capture it. The man came back and told him that there was a dragon that had appeared from the sea, and he needed 500 archers to kill the beast and open the way. Emperor Qin Shi Huan, yes, that one, said, checks out, and the general was never seen from again. A few generations later, we get the mythical story of Grasscutter, one of Japan's 3 imperial treasures that, happens to look a lot like a Chinese imperial officer's sword at the time. Some people think that guy might have been the Emperor Jimmu of mythological founding of Japan. Not gonna loom on that for very long, though. That's not really this particular scenario. Suffice to say that there's a lot of precedent for what Emperor Dezong is doing here. Just as with so many emperors before and after him, it was perfectly reasonable at the time to assume that there could only be 2 ways this ended. Either they'd never return and it would be just like they'd been assassinated anyway, or they'd actually conquer Japan or some other section of Asia, and then Emperor Dezong would be lauded as having brought yet more land into the empire. For millennia, this is how emperors solved their problems, this win-win economy of mandatory exile by way of military mission. But this time, something new will happen that will change the timeline forever. This time, another act of nature will take them from one side of the Pacific to the other.
Upon embarking on their journey to Japan, they are almost immediately beset by a typhoon which diverts them from the initially charted course. They try to correct their course to get to Japan again, not knowing right away that they're miles off course. At this time, they are blown into the North Pacific. Left with little other choice, the fleet follows the currents as traditional Polynesian wisdom decrees. It's a long and uncomfortable voyage, for the Pacific is vast and has few landmarks of note. So the fleet is not sure when they'll see land precisely, only that they should eventually sight land and dock as soon as they can to take stock of the situation. After many months of drifting at sea, resorting to fishing with scraps of their clothes off the sides of their ships, they are relieved to see land on the horizon. Little do they know their troubles are just beginning as they land on Vancouver Island. Only half the fleet has actually made it to land at this point. They're bedraggled, hungry, and very, very lost. Their ships need repair, their feet need the dryness of land, and they are desperately short on supplies.
Let us tell you about the Chinookan and Silesian peoples that they find when they land. These people were a highly established, sedentary people who had a huge cultural influence, loosely ranging from southern Alaska to northern California. They lived in sedentary villages, had giant trade and communication networks stretching to the Aleutians, Southern California, and into the Great Plains, and they were so powerful that the cultures in the areas surrounding them eventually started taking on their own traditions so that they could be seen as more like them and thus less of a target. These people were the superpower of the region at the time, much as they weren't exactly a unified monolith. The Pacific Northwest coastal natives were also, first and foremost, a bunch of extremely warlike slavers. They had concepts of land ownership, territorial disputes, blood feuds, and extremely familiar systems of property rights to what we might consider today. When people talk about how the Native Americans didn't have conventional concepts in their language for fences and land management, they are not talking about the Pacific Northwesterners, and one of the only reasons that the Pacific Northwesterners were eventually defeated by the advance of the Europeans was because they had never developed a farming culture that they could rely on in times of long-standing extreme conflict. So lush was the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years that agriculture was simply never needed, merely a refined tradition of land management and renewal carried out by the people of the area. And that land was explicitly handed around as possessions and given to others in giant community celebrations called potlatches. A very complex system of societal and religious practices had sprouted up over thousands of years in this area, and into this highly refined society would enter 50,000 hangry, desperate, lost foreigners who had no idea what anyone was saying and didn't care what was asked of them, because they are about to die, and no community in the entirety of the Pacific Northwest could contain them. Whether or not the Silesian and Chinookan natives they would first meet would want to be peaceful, such a fleet cannot be accepted anywhere, and would be chased off immediately upon its arrival. This would not be a welcome thing, and so the people of the expedition would have no choice but to attack back and take whatever resources they could wherever they went.
Not to mention, this is no diplomatic delegation. These very foreigners are the finest soldiers that the Tang dynasty sent on a conquest. Finding out that these people aren't Japanese and not able to understand any of the languages the Tang people know in the first place, misunderstandings and bloodshed become the first impression of the contact with the people of the New World. Because of the strong Silesian Chinookan presence where they land, the Tang castaways raid and trade their way down the coast of Mexico over the next year. In the meantime, they record what they see on their travels, especially the languages, geography, plants, and animals. During their travels, while the Chinese trade with whoever is willing to do so, they have to raid for supplies and nobody welcomes them. Thankfully, their superior technology gives them the advantage in traversing this previously unknown and dangerous land. Sometimes, they even manage to befriend locals who sign on as permanent guides for their expedition, helping them quickly understand the cultural landscape of the New World. They arrive on the coast of the La Quimada territory in 792, a thriving trade nexus in Central America. The Chinese partake in some trading sprees in La Quimada to fill their hold with exotic goods and cargo, then set off for home, no longer bedraggled or on the brink of starvation. They unwittingly leave behind illnesses which the locals don't have immunity against, potentially leading to their deaths. The Chinese don't even have time in any given stop to realize that they are spreading plague wherever they go.
The trip down the west coast of North America would gradually get easier and easier. Up in Vancouver Island, the natives need to be raided and repelled with the overwhelming technological advantage the Chinese lord over them. Able to make ballistae that can fire bolts over 1,000 yards and crossbows that could fire 250 yards, they could outrange any native bow with casual ease. Though gunpowder had not yet been invented, the Chinese had lime bombs that could blind people and poison gas grenades that could make people choke on their own blood until they died. Metal weapons could punch through any native hide, and metal armor could resist most native weapons. And for their troubles, they could get all manner of amazing things like cranberries, blueberries, Oregon grape, huckleberry, and camas root. Eventually, as they arrived in Mexico, they would discover trade networks stretching in all the way from the East Coast, port towns, and literal cities once they got into the bulk of Central America. The Chinese, in the New World, would find it changing from cold and wet to warm and dry, from dangerous and unwelcoming to what they would almost call civilized and inclined toward trade and commerce. And at the time, most of the New World crops we think about would be available at some point to the fleet. Even potatoes, domesticated in the Andes, had worked their way up to modern-day Mexico alongside sweet potato, cassava, maize, beans, tomatoes, and chilies. The list of practical staple crops available to them would have really just been a continually expanding one with every mile they sailed down the west coast. Perhaps more tempting even still to the unwitting explorers, the glory of vanilla, tobacco, allspice, and cocoa were just waiting for them. Such a grand display as this fleet would be well accepted in the trade hubs of Central America, and, despite their lack of actual trade goods and poor understanding of the local languages, many agreements would be possible with ceremonial gestures, offerings, and traditional rituals of alliance and such. Surely, a good few Chinese sailors would leave those shores with a native wife, and a few of those wives would even survive the journey back to China thanks to the meticulous care of Chinese medicine at the time. Most of all, the most important of what they would bring back would be a combination of seeds, people, and information. It would be no question of whether or not they were telling the truth about this land of new foods, new people, and new resources. Here they were, having been brought back to China for the Empire's use. Instead, it would be for Emperor Dezong to decide exactly how much it was worth to him to go back. And the journey across the Pacific, while truly gigantic, would have been prepared for this time. With full holds and an understanding of the Pacific swells, the fairly calm North Equatorial Pacific Current would pull them along plentiful fishing routes and good swells right until they would come to see clouds on the horizon that only form over land. Seabirds would show them where to go, and before long, they'd arrive in a land that wouldn't yet have much in the way of permanent human inhabitation, a tropical paradise as of yet untouched by society. They'd find their way to the volcanic islands of Hawaii.
Hawaii is a much more pleasant place to stop by in comparison to their coastal journey from Vancouver. The climate reminds them of the warmer regions of South China and even Southeast Asia, places that they know of. Since it is still a long sail back to China and the Chinese aren't in a great hurry to get back yet, they spent a few years setting things up in Hawaii, cultivating their newly gained plants to get a better understanding how they grow, mapping the islands, and recording the wildlife. For even though Hawaii reminds them of South China, it's not quite the same. As for the natives who came along with the Chinese fleet, while some unfortunately succumbed to the illnesses brought over, the rest survived due to the meticulous care and advanced medical knowledge of Chinese doctors, better than European knowledge of medicine at this point in time. The doctors prescribed a temporary stop for the ill to convalesce, spending 6 years on the Hawaiian Islands. The only thing lacking in the whole stopover? Too many men and a lack of their usual preferred companionship. Ultimately, the Chinese fleet decide to return to China due to the realization their new world cargo is an opportunity to regain the emperor's good graces. They leave a fifth of their number, around 10,000 men, and promise to return with women and supplies.
As of 798, when 40,000 sailors set sea from Hawaii for China proper, the Hawaiian island chain has no evidence of permanent inhabitation. Perhaps there were as many as a few hundred people in transient sailing communities on the Big Island, but, by and large, the Hawaiian Islands would not be settled until much later. The Chinese, when they arrived to this tropical paradise, would think this place some sort of secret utopia, a land of the gods, wherein no life was big enough to put up a fight, marine resources were plentiful, and the jungles gave freely of their fruit and meat. Just as the New World had hidden great and wondrous things, so too did the bulk of the Central Pacific end up providing the Chinese with yet more great things to bring back. And taking them over would be child's play, as some of the islands can literally be seen from one another, making it impossible to get lost in transit from island to island. And with a bit more of an understanding of what they are doing than the eventual Polynesian settlers of the Hawaiian Islands, the Chinese are able to take all manner of seeds, samples, and specimens back to China, potentially saving various species that didn't make it to today in our timeline, such as various species of goose and duck that were killed off by the first settlers of the islands. Without anyone to stop them, the remaining 10,000 Chinese sailors would spread out along the chain and mostly survive off of the plentiful marine resources the islands have to offer. For now, they view these islands as a sacred place, a place of rest and relaxation during the longest of journeys. But the fleets wouldn't only find Hawaii on the way back to China. The currents along the equator would carry the fleet into the flourishing islands of equatorial Australasia, where they'll meet other Polynesians who will be able to guide them in. farther east than any Chinese ship has ever been, it would be possible for them to both hide their New World goods and pick up yet more undiscovered bounty on the way back. Even so, after 2 years island hopping back to the west, the fleet would find themselves in Borneo or the Philippines, and from there, reaching China would be a fairly standard affair. After 10 years of absence, the generals sent off to take Japan or die would return with the bounty of a whole new world, with seeds and maps, spices and new naval technology, people and animals never before seen from a land ripe for the taking.
The fleet re-enters the imperial court and seeks an audience with Dezong. They have brought back new allies from the farthest reaches of the world. Their cargo of the New World speaks for itself about the world far beyond Japan or the Silk Road. Seeing those he sent away singing his praises and bringing him so much, Dezong realizes that they actually are loyal to him, enough to make him reconsider everything the eunuchs were saying 10 years ago, before he sent the generals away. Having seen the frugality of the sailors on their long adventure leading to such success and great bounty, Dezong reconsiders his budding profligate ways and endorses new economic standards that will save him money, which he can then spend on more ships to explore the new world. The audience with his returning generals inspires him to place more trust in the military aristocracy and to further provide for expeditions to the other side of the world. With the advent of Tangguo sails and new standards of navigation tried and tested by the original fleet, Dezong understands that it will be best if he ignores the greed of the eunuch courts and instead empowers new admirals to bring yet more treasure and glory to his reign.
Numerous other expeditions would naturally follow this glorious return to Tang, China. Able to successfully guide a new fleet more safely across the North Pacific, they would repeat the process by 805, successfully mapping the ocean and populating the many islands of Polynesia. Free to explore, it would only be natural that the updated Chinese ships would find themselves carrying home everything from gold to cocoa. Interested most prominently in trade rather than manifest destiny, however, disease is not purposefully spread to the natives of North America, and, instead, wherever possible, the Chinese would assist in the recovery of native populations to preserve their trade partners and thus their payday. Even so, historically, tragedy struck in our timeline around now. Emperor Dezong's favorite son was struck by a debilitating stroke, and the blow was so great that the emperor died that year from depression. Life had been hard to Dezong, and he probably just didn't have it in him anymore. However, in this timeline, things are much more optimistic. Money is rolling in, Dezong has begun to live a healthier and more frugal lifestyle, and money is rolling in. We can't stress enough, the money is just rolling. Instead of dying of depression, he would name the Hawaiian Islands after his beloved son and send Li Song off to the Song Islands to live out the remainder of his days in a tropical paradise. Sadly, the heir to the empire would die en route, but the islands would still go on to bear his name and would eventually become the personal possession of Emperor Dezong himself.
This is where things truly diverge from our world's history. Emperor Dezong doesn't die of a broken heart despite his son's stroke. He sees the potential riches of the New World as stated earlier, but with his newfound frugality, he arranges for research and development of new weaponry to better arm and equip the navy. Some of the new developments include semi-auto crossbows, mounted harpoons, and ship-bound net throwers to entangle smaller vessels and their crew. Recalling that the navy originally set out to capture Japanese territory, this particular mission is resumed, this time with far less of a setback than over a decade ago. Owing to the newly minted weaponry and better knowledge of the oceanic conditions surrounding Japan and Korea, further missions to create vassal states in Japan and Korea meet with resounding success. The unified sealer are forced into an even deeper tributary role, and Kyushu is annexed outright by the Chinese advance, along with many ports and outposts as far north as modern-day Sendai. The Japanese are still struggling through the 38-year war against the Emishi, and so cannot resist the far superior Chinese forces that demand safe harbor on the way to the treacherous North Pacific crossing.
And we can't stress enough that, with just a few trips across the Big Blue, the Chinese would have a functionally unbroken route to the New World through the Aleutian Islands, down along the rocky shores of Canada, and right into the beautiful bounty of the extremely violent Pacific Northwest. Able to more successfully manage the waves with the help of Japanese and Korean sailors in the north and Polynesians in the south, the big circle that runs around the rim of the Pacific would provide them with everything they need to maintain a near constant trade route for the rest of Dezong's life. What's more, every time they would venture off into the Central Pacific, they'd find more islands, more spits of land sticking out of the waves, waiting to be colonized. Eventually, even the South Pacific would be navigated as the Chinese exploration fleets stretched out their influence to see just how far the coast of the New World stretched. Gold and silver from the mountains of South America and British Columbia, Alaska, and eventually the Rockies would bring huge luxury to the Chinese aristocracy and, gradually, begin to push the eunuch courts out entirely. No longer would Dezong find import in the scheming and intrigue of courtly politics, but rather on the newest discoveries across the waves, of the new people and languages that were being written about, of the crazy adventures some of his trusted servants were getting themselves into. And more, he would see the eunuchs for the jealous, power-hungry plotters that they were, and invest more of his time, resources, and attention into the aristocratic elites, constantly competing to bring him more ideas on how to capture these unexplored lands. Of course, this sort of thing would absolutely start to annihilate his treasuries within a very short amount of time. New tributaries, new goods, new crops, new land, and new technologies, but the same old money problems, even though Dezong has since worked very hard to curb his personal spending habits. The New World is simply too far away, and the colonization effort merely too expensive to maintain long term. But the gains! The respect! The adventure! It is, simply put, too much to pass up. No self-respecting emperor like Dezong would be able to turn away from the potential discoveries that awaited. Who knows? Perhaps if he just went a little bit farther, kept it up a little bit more, the exploration fleets would find something that would make up for every expense. Perhaps if he were to dedicate that much more to the colonization and exploitation of the New World and Polynesia, stability for the entire empire could be maintained.
The year is 820. Dezong, now 77 years of age, looks back upon everything his nation has achieved. There's a land where the streets are paved with gold and jade. Each man is an emperor in his own right, and Milu, imperial pets back in the motherland, now wander freely in the wilderness of the New World. Approaching his 80th birthday, he wishes his son Li Song is still around to see the enduring glory of the empire. Everything that his loyal men have done, even if it took years, culminates in this grandeur. Overflowing riches and resources, all men with their own contentment. Not to mention Japan and Korea no longer being an issue due to their status as vassal states. He doesn't have so much to worry about at present. Lingering regrets remain, but not as direly as in our world's history. All around him people are happy and healthy. The empire stretches from shore to sandy shore, consuming the entire northern Pacific and much of northern Polynesia in its embrace. New goods are coming from the New World, and new people are being integrated into the Chinese system. Surely, when he dies, the empire will continue on smoothly in his memory.
Sadly, for Emperor Dezong, there are times when the glorious ambitions of a single leader are both the pillars upon which an empire rises, and the fires which ultimately burn a nation to ashes. In our timeline, Emperor Dezong was the high water mark for the Tang before it inevitably declined and collapsed. However, in this timeline, Emperor Dezong stokes the glorious flame of Chinese ambition until it is brighter than the sun. And instead of slowly dying out, as it did in our own timeline, Dezong's great legacy burns out the moment his body goes cold. In our timeline, Li Song, regardless of how short his reign might have been, succeeded his father after Dezong died of a depression following his stroke. Though his rule was short and basically a regency from start to finish, It also gave the eunuch courts more time to manipulate the empire to be, if nothing else, stable enough for them to do what they wanted to do. The eunuchs are no longer present as a stabilizing administrative element, and the aristocrats are stronger and more spread out now than ever. Dezong's many sons and grandchildren, all older than 50, are out of touch and out of patience for the throne, and will all descend into infighting and the classic succession crisis that occasionally tears all of China apart. The mandate of heaven was lost the moment that Dezong took his final breath, and China will be flung into civil war for generations. But that will have to wait until next time. Thanks a bunch, everybody, for coming. Hope you liked what you saw here today. Remember to like, subscribe, comment, share, go on down to our Patreon via that Linktree link in the description. Pledge even just $1 a month to help support the cause and join the mighty, mighty ranks of all the lovely people in the credit section at the end of every video, just like you see here. And, of course, go on down to our description and check out Avaline Ryu and all of her wonderful places that she does stuff, both from YouTube to Twitter to Blue Sky and all those awesome places. She did all of the art that was actually arted here, like the art rather than the pictures that we just took offline or whatever, to make sure that you had something to look at. Preferably, though, you didn't mind it because you were doing your chores or, like, wandering around the property or riding your bike or something like that. You know, Milo Rossi style. So, yeah. Thanks a bunch once again, everybody, for coming. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay safe, stay healthy, stay inside, and, of course, remember to help each other. Bye!